Biden is back in the United States after attending the G7 summit in Italy. The group announced $50 billion in new financing for Ukraine from frozen Russian assets. The White House said the United States will work with the country and the G7 leaders to finalize details of the loan in the coming months. It will provide money for Ukraine's military and reconstruction by the end of the year. And just this morning, Vice President Kamala Harris announced the U.S. will provide an additional $1.5 billion to bolster Ukraine's energy sector and humanitarian needs. Joining us now is Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and MSNBC contributor Eugene Daniels, White House correspondent for Politico. Reed, Galen, Eugene, Daniels, welcome to you both. So this is, I said this was a great week for the president. He's having these back-to-back weeks, both the national stage and domestically. The economy, the numbers were strong coming out on inflation. How should the president's team contextualize these types of images, these types of moments, both now and going forward, as you have a 34 indicted former president running against him, wailing and speaking incoherently at rallies, and you know, a base around him that is churning but not really turning, I think, the votes in the way a lot of people think they are.
Well, I would say this is that there are a large number of Republican voters. I think people we might call them Nikki Haley voters, right, that do not like Donald Trump on national security in particular. These are older voters. They tend to be white men in the suburbs, based on our research. We even call them something Red Dawn conservatives. They remember Ronald Reagan. They never liked the Soviet Union, and so they don't like this now. They don't like Donald Trump cozying up. And so I think the more that the White House and the campaign can make the president look like the commander-in-chief, put him in a position of showing that America is in its place in the world as a leader, I think is very good, not only to bolster support with the Democratic base, because a lot of the Democratic base is pro-Ukraine, but I think also with those soft Republicans who really don't want to go back to Trump. They're not quite convinced on Joe Biden yet.
I like the Red Dawn idea.
Eugene, President Biden said that taken together, the security agreement and the loan deal, they bolster Ukraine. They send an unmistakable message to Putin. What is the message? What is the signaling that the White House is trying to do here?
Yeah, what President Biden and his team have been trying to do since the beginning of Russia's invasion into Ukraine is to let the world know, to get this group of European countries and America together to tell Russia to, one, cut it out, and more importantly, that they have Ukraine's back, and in turn, largely Europe's back, right? Because this is Russia knocking on Europe's front and back and side doors. And what they're really trying to do is keep Russia from thinking they can do these kinds of things without any kind of blowback, right? You look at the sanctions that have happened over and over and over again, the frozen assets. And also, this is always, as much foreign policy deals are in this country nowadays, about China, right? To making sure that China knows they can't do this to Taiwan later on, right? So saying, look at how the rest of the world comes together when an autocrat tries to take over a democracy and another country they believe is theirs. And so this is also about them letting China know, like, if you try this, we also got something for you as well.
It's amazing because you think about the fact that the president is playing chess and the former president at best is playing like hungry hippo.
Yeah, well, if that, maybe Uno. I'm going to give him Uno,
You're
maybe.
giving him Uno?
He's playing Uno.
Oh, okay.
Uno, and somebody keeps telling him draw 4. I just, you know, it's the split screen this week, much like the split screen last week. You keep talking about the split screens that have happened. And again, much for everyone that's saying, you know, oh, Joe Biden seems a little too old. I don't know about you, but from France, doing all these things, coming back to America, going back out to the G7 in Italy. Now he's on his way to L.A. right now as we speak to do another event. This is, and I don't know where Donald Trump has been. Oh, yes, I didn't know where he's been. Railing against a machine on a stage. The split screen here is something that should not be taken lightly. And I think about the announcement from the vice president today on her way to the peace summit in Switzerland, where I do believe next hour we're going to see her with President Zelensky of Ukraine, the G7 leaders meeting their commitment that they made to Ukraine with the split screen of Vladimir Putin. going out yesterday, I believe, talking about what he needs for what he would do, outlining his peace plan for Ukraine. It's like the arsonist is talking about how to put out the fires, and Cole Wallace said earlier this week about Donald Trump being on Capitol Hill. Reed, how do you think a domestic audience, right? Like the political professionals sitting around here at the table, and Eugene in his very fancy background today, we understand and we get this. Right. What about everyday, as I like to say, everyday regular people who may not be paying close attention to why Joe Biden was even in Italy this week, thinking he might have just been on summer vacation? Right. How does all of the things that happened this week translate to the people?
I think at this point it's probably a little bit still early. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit marginal, but I think it shows that the one thing we've known about Joe Biden since he took office is this is a man who meets his moments. He met his moment at the beginning. He met his moment with the economic crisis in the wake of COVID. He met his moment with Ukraine. He has met his moment over and over and over again. And I think now, look, we're just a few days away now from that first debate. And so what the split screen is going to look like is exactly what we're going to see in Atlanta not too long from now, which is someone railing against the ghosts. Who else is in the room with you, Donald? Do you see the people there? With someone who's going to be like, you really want 4 more years of this? You want this back? And I think it's a very stark thing. And there are more Americans. Look, a lot of Americans are upset about their choices. Got it. OK, but this is where we are. We all know that. Like, we're locked in. People are going to say, wait a second. You know, yes, inflation is high. It's coming down. But do I want to go back into a place of more chaos like I had? Do I want to wake up every morning and worry about what the president's thinking? That's what people in Russia have to do. And I don't think that's what the American people will end up wanting.
Well, I think it's also a matter of reminding them and waking up in the morning and wondering what members of the president's family are doing. Mm-hmm. You know, the grift keeps on giving with this crew. And you've got Viktor Orban, of great repute, tweeting about his meeting with Don Jr., noting, I had a great meeting today at Donald Trump, or whatever, in Budapest. We discussed how we can make Hungarian-U.S. relations great again as they were under the presidency of Donald Trump. The problem is, since Mr. Trump Jr., Eugene, is not an employee of the federal government meeting with the head of a foreign government, it's sort of a violation of the Logan Act. But hell, you know, one violation here, one violation there. It's kind of par for the course for the Trump crew. So my point is they have not changed in their behavior nor their approach to government. It's all about, setting up these relationships and putting in place these opportunities. When you're sending your son out to go meet with the head of a foreign government, my view of that's not a good day in government relations. But what's your take, and how should we be reading these types of actions by the Trump team?
I mean, at best, what it means is that they're doubling down on kind of creating relationships with strongmen, right? Donald Trump, while he was president, talked about and talked to his aides and publicly about how he liked how people like Viktor Orban or people or Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, how they took power, how they had power, how they wielded their power in their countries. And that has continued, right? You continue to hear former President Trump talk about his affinity for Orban and how he operates in his own country. And this is something that, you talk to Democratic experts, small, lowercase d here, and what they'll tell you is that this should be concerning for a lot of Americans, people who believe that kind of the experiment that we've been operating under should continue, and it shouldn't be changed. It should be tweaked and it should be broadened for more people, but that this is the path we should continue on. But when you watch Donald Trump Jr. go and have these meetings, what it shows you is that the Trump team, the Trump family, they want to continue to build these stronger relationships with stronger men around the world. Now, Donald Trump himself thinks that makes America look stronger, right? Because these guys are tough and they wield their power in certain ways. Other people, probably a lot of, maybe everybody on this panel, would say the opposite. And that is something that the American people are going to be reminded. I can promise you that if not later today, sometime this week, you'll probably see the Biden campaign talk about this meeting in some way, shape, or form.